And the administration sent Harold Coe, the legal advisor to the State Department. Now, I know Mr. Coe. In fact, I testified when he was out of office against the Military Commissions Act of 2006 before the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is the act that enables the president to detain U.S. citizens as enemy combatants, whatever that means. It means you're affiliated with al-Qaeda. And they've never defined affiliated, since they understand al-Qaeda doesn't give you membership cards, you don't pay dues, you know. You don't wear numbers and say al-Qaeda number 3 or second team or things like that. They really don't know even how to define who is al-Qaeda, other than they suggest emulating Potter Stewart on obscenity. I know it when I see it. That's, you know, passes for due process or passes for law these days. But Mr. Coe is in office now. He was testifying before as the dean of the Yale Law School. Then he goes to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not hostilities in Libya, because hostilities requires that we have foot soldiers on the ground or pilots flying close enough to the ground that they could be shot down by anti-aircraft missiles. I said, well, let's see. Is it hostilities then if we launch nuclear weapons from the United States on ICBMs and destroy every living, breathing thing in Libya with nuclear warheads? No, no hostilities. No foot soldiers. Nobody's flying close enough to get shot down. Oh, so you could destroy the whole world in a nuclear holocaust and you're not in hostilities? Yep. Now, we really are in 1984. And there's no response. I mean, it's such an insult to anyone's intelligence. You can destroy the whole world, you're not at war. Wow. You know, that's, into Humpty Dumpty, a word means whatever I want it to mean. This is the United States Congress in confronting a grave issue. And I say, this is where we are, ladies. This is the rape of the Constitution in plain view. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. That's why nothing happened when it was announced the president has U.S. citizens on assassination lists. We now have a situation, I'm probably subject to this myself, you may be in the audience, where the FBI has now a new category of investigation along the same line that flouts the Fourth Amendment. The category is called an assessment. Now, ordinarily, for the first years of the FBI's existence, and when I was at the Justice Department, it couldn't begin a preliminary investigation unless there was an articulable suspicion based upon a tip or some public evidence that the target of the investigation was implicated in some way or could be in crime. But the assessments came out of a different kind of standard and mentality. They start because the FBI agent has not a shred of evidence that the target is involved in crime, not a shred of evidence that they would be involved in terrorism. But that FBI agent had a nightmare or a dream and thinks, oh, that person might in the future turn to crime or to terrorism. And on that hunch, he then can have informants paid to spy on you, inquire of your employer, your wife, your friends, your educators, compile dossiers on you, precisely because you've committed the crime of not showing any evidence of wrongdoing. 80,000 of these just last year. Now, they have to at least sign a piece of paper when they begin an assessment saying, identifying the agent and the target. That's too much. They're now proposing to enable them to begin these assessments with no paper trail at all. So no one will ever know what kind of abuses were perpetrated by the FBI agents. And their attitude is, well, you should be happy we're doing assessments. You know, otherwise we'd think you're either a criminal or a terrorist. You know, that's what we, that's how the United States is. They're guilty until we clear you. I mean, this is monstrous. This is the East German Stasi. Guilty before proven innocent. The Fourth Amendment guarantees the right to be left alone, the most cherished right among civilized people. Indeed, it was violations of the right to privacy that was the spark that culminated in the revolution. the protests against the writs of assistance, and any petty officer coming into homes looking for contraband. That is what provoked, and where are we today? Big brother government? We're already in some places experimenting with surveillance drones. Not predator drones yet. Surveillance drones to be utilized to identify where we're going, what we're doing, whenever we step outside the house. And we have at present pending in the United States Supreme Court a case that's somewhat similar, using these GPS tracers so that the police can identify and follow you without a warrant at all through the GPS satellite system. Identify your habits, your traffic patterns, and everything of that sort. And this is whether presented to the Supreme Court, is this amount to a search that is required to pass the Fourth Amendment threshold of probable cause and a warrant issued by a judge. The argument that the government makes, oh, well, you're just exposing your travel patterns to everybody in the world, and therefore it doesn't matter whether we use artificial means to capture what no one could possibly do if it was left to their own devices to try to follow someone. Due process is the most important concept ever created in the history of civilization. It's incorporated, of course, in our Constitution. And why is that? Due process is the first acknowledgement by us that we can get it wrong, that we may have biases and prejudices. We need to listen to the other side before we impose punishments. It's that intellectual humility that says, yeah, I have to listen as well as speak. It's what's been the linchpin of knowledge and civilization for thousands of years, due process of law. It first emerged explicitly at Runnymede in 1215, Great Britain, the Magna Carta. You can get it wrong. And what have we done today? Due process is out the window. We suspend habeas corpus. On the halls of Congress, I hear these things. Well, Mr. Fein, why do you want to give any due process? Why should there be any hearings or habeas corpus for those at Guantanamo Bay? They're all guilty as terrorists. Well, sir, they haven't been tried yet. That goes, they don't even get that. Trials in their own minds, once they've decided someone's guilty, that's the end of the matter. You do away with hearings. You do away with judging. You do away with trials. You know, the epitome of arbitrariness that we associated with Thomas de Torquemada, but even he had some show trials. And again, there isn't any protest. In Congress thinks, in many respects, there's too liberal down at Guantanamo Bay. Well, there you don't get a judicial trial. They have these, what they call combatant tribunals that hold hearings that would make kangaroo courts look like a model of due process. The detainee is not alerted to what it is that has caused the military to believe they're an enemy combatant. They called up, and you can read these transcripts that have been published. Well, sir, how come you're not an enemy combatant? Oh, tell me what it is that lets you think that I'm an enemy combatant, that I'm allied with Al-Qaeda. Well, that's your problem. You know, you tell us why you're not. He says, well, I don't know what I've been charged with. Okay, you lose. No confrontation, secret evidence. He can't call, yeah, you can call witnesses unless the military people think it would be disruptive of the military campaigns to bring them back to Guantanamo to testify, which is virtually all the time. So you can imagine why it's not likely that any of these detainees will be released, even when the grounds and the foundations are utterly preposterous. Let me make a brief detour here to recount my own experience with regard to 17 detainees at Guantanamo. And remember, as background here, that then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had insisted only the worst of the worst were at Guantanamo. Those that it'd be like walking through the Holocaust Museum. Such devils and Satans and Mephistopheles were there. Well, the 17 Uighurs, the Uighurs are a small East Turkestan Muslim group that opposes the Chinese communists, and they've been struggling for decades for autonomy. they had been training in part of their opposition to the Chinese communists in Afghanistan at the time of 9/11 and when we began our initial invasion. And 17 of them were picked up. And because, in part, the United States, in order to fill up the camps at Guantanamo, advertised, if you find an Al-Qaeda, you can retire on the Riviera $1 million. So they got a lot of false positives. Because Afghans aren't overwhelmingly like Mr. Bloomberg, and hey, this is a chance to get some money, turn somebody in. 17 Uighurs at Guantanamo Bay. There was never any evidence that had any connection with Al-Qaeda whatsoever. Why would they love the United States? They sat and rotted there for almost 8 years. Finally, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Boumediene versus Bush, said, no, you have to give them a hearing. You've got to come forth with some evidence to show that they're enemy combatants, they're connected with Al-Qaeda if you want to continue to detain them. It comes time, and I was involved in representing the 17 Uighurs as amicus curiae. And it comes time for the government to present the evidence that Uighurs are enemy combatants. Say, Your Honor, we have none. We agree they've been illegally detained all these years. The judge says, all right, well, I'm going to release them into society here because everyone conceded if they were returned to China, they'd be tortured or killed. And there's a treaty that prevents us from returning people in those circumstances. So Department of Justice is outraged, says, no, you can't do that, Your Honor. We have to keep them at Guantanamo Bay. And he says, well, why is that? Because there had been the head of the Uyghur American Association, his name is Rebia Kadir. She's been 3 times nominated Nobel Peace Prize, and she had promised that she would ensure the Uyghurs were not public charges and would take responsibility for their compliance with the law and otherwise. And the Justice Department said, and this is Obama administration, no, they can't come to the United States. The Judge Irvine said, well, why is that? He says, well, they're illegal aliens. They got no green cards. We kidnapped them, and they didn't ask for any. No, so what only the executive can decide, who can come to the United States. They have to stay at Guantanamo Bay. The judge thought that was rather patently ridiculous on its face and rejected the argument. It went up on appeal, however, and the Uyghurs were returned to Guantanamo Bay. The appellate court, at the behest of the Obama administration, decided, yeah, that the Uyghurs were illegal aliens. Then that decision was presented to the U.S. Supreme Court that granted review. So it was going to be decided by the Supreme Court whether we were going to live in a world of Humpty Dumpty. But before the Supreme Court could decide, the Obama administration began to shop to see whether they could find some other countries that would take the Uyghurs. Now, we didn't want to take them, not because they were threatening to anybody in the United States, but the Chinese might retaliate and not buy our bonds. So we sort of sold our soul for a mess of pottage. As some, we said, no, we'll not take 17 individuals who we conceded we had illegally detained for 8 years because the Chinese might get angry. That's that's our country. That's our country. I testified for Congress. I had never been so ashamed of being an American.